Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's meeting, which is on the subject of identity or class politics and where we stand on this issue. So let's go over to George, if you're ready there.
Yes, Rob, thank you very much indeed. Thanks all of you for joining us on the Zoom. If you are a member of the Workers' Party and everyone watching on other platforms, we hope soon to be able to welcome you onto our Zoom meetings as a member of the Workers' Party of Britain. I'm not intending to speak for as long this evening, partly because I've covered this issue as part of other issues in the quite recent past, partly because I feel that the members will have more questions, more to say on our point of view on these issues than perhaps in other cases. Perhaps on other subjects there might be more of a consensus within the party. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong about that. But let me start by talking about what I'm not going to be talking about, if that Donald Rumsfeldism isn't too bemusing. I bear, the Workers' Party bears absolutely no animus against anyone at all on account of that which they are, over which they have no choice, have made no invidious choice. Our animus is brought to bear on those who choose to act in sociopathic, antisocial ways against the good of society, against the working class interests. So, for example, we care not whether the sweatshop owner is black or white, man or woman, gay or straight, or self-identifying as a woman. None of these things matter to us. We're against the sweatshop owner because he or she is a sweatshop owner. That ought to be obvious, but sometimes isn't. It follows, therefore, that we cannot accept that someone criticized can themselves self-define the reasons why they're being criticized. So, for example, if to take the example of a woman whom I know well, with whom I was friends for a long time, and whom I defend from vicious, racist and misogynistic abuse, Diane Abbott. If I attack Diane Abbott because of her stand on Brexit, which was utterly deplorable and which helped create a situation where Labour lost the last general election, and that we were then dependent on Marcus Rashford to ensure that our children had a free school dinner over the summer. If I attack Diane Abbott for her stand on Brexit, I am not attacking her because she is black or because she is a woman. And she is not entitled to define my criticism as having been so. That's in a way, again, obvious, but actually in practice, not. Because we have reached a situation in Britain, I think throughout the Western world, where woke sensibilities have dictated that people can define themselves, whether criticism of themselves is racist or sexist or any other ist. Let me give you an example of someone with whom I'm not friends. Sadiq Khan is the worst mayor of London, and that's saying something, as his predecessor was Boris Johnson. Sadiq Khan is an atrocious mayor of London, a disastrous mayor of London. He deserves to be defeated next May as mayor of London. And none of that, from our point of view, from where we stand has anything to do with the color of his skin or his creed or his religion. In fact, these are two of the only good things that you could say about him. But he oftentimes defines criticism of himself, of his actions, as being racist, as being Islamophobic, and no doubt other icks and ists. And this drives people crazy. It drives them into a state of anger in which they might use language which we wouldn't use, in which they might proceed along a line of invective which is no good and which causes no good. And therefore, the people, the working people, are divided by a kind of wokeness that our deputy leader, Jyoti Brar, spoke so brilliantly about on RT recently. If you haven't watched that program yet, you must. It's with Peter Lavelle, Bullhorn, it's called. This wokeness, this woke sensibility, I don't know who invented it. I don't know if our enemies invented it. But if they didn't, they might as well have. Because whoever invented it did a good job in having us all chasing each other, chasing our own tails about our language, about our pronouns, about our wokeness. And this serves the ruling class well. If we are fighting on the streets between black people and white people, or between people that don't like a certain religion and those who do, then we're not fighting the rulers. It's a fight between different sections of the ruled. And in a way, our prescription is very simple. And I've restated it over and over again. Although we all have multiple identities, the fundamental identity, which matters most, and just as importantly, would allow, if we all could come together, the maximum power in opposition to the way things are, is the identity of class. In other words, all the gay people in the world cannot change it. All the black people in the world cannot change it. All the women in the world cannot change it. But of all the men and women, gay and straight, black and white of the world, who constituted the working class, which constitutes the vast majority of the population of the country, of the world, if all of them could come together, then we could really change things. It's not that we don't support reforms that are designed to make people nicer to each other or less beastly towards each other. Of course we support them. I'm the holder of a Stonewall Award given to me well over 20 years ago, nearly 30 years ago, as one of a tiny handful of members of Parliament who supported the realignment of the age of consent for gay people with that of straight people, but who voted against what I call the Rosa Parks option of allowing Rosa to sit in the middle of the bus, just not at the front. The government tabled legislation to reduce the age of consent for gay people from 21, but not to 16, as was the case for straight people, but to 18. So I voted for an age of 16 and voted against an age of 18, which would have just institutionalized discrimination, but on a slightly different number. And I was given a Stonewall Award at that time. In fact, if you examine my voting record in the House of Commons, you will you will discover it flawless from the standpoint of gay rights. Literally blemish-free, flawless. And yet you wouldn't think that, would you? If you look at the static that we in the Workers' Party, or I as an individual, get from people who are either in the gay rights movement or are not gay themselves, but who like to use these things as a yardstick to measure people with, you would think that somehow I was a reactionary on this matter, when the opposite is the truth. I just don't believe that people like us, a working class party fighting for socialism, should go down alleys which at best will be blind, and at worst will further divide the working class, will make the chasm that exists between different sections of the working class more widely. So in Parliament, I supported reforms for gay people. But I always pointed out, as I've always pointed out to you, and do so again now, if life became perfect for gay people, if discrimination was finally consigned to the Bristol Harbour, if everyone was absolutely woke about the rights of people to love whom they like and where they like, with obvious limitations of public decency, if people were able to hold hands, kiss, do all the things they wanted to do, that would all be fine for those people, but it wouldn't change anything about our society fundamentally. And it's the fundamentals of our society that produce discrimination, bigotry, hatred, racism, and so on. In other words, if you, or perhaps I can call in aid here James Connolly, if you run the British flag down the flagpole in Dublin Castle and replace it with a green flag, but don't change anything else, then you will be merely exchanging one form of domination with another. Whereas we want to run a red flag up over the castle. We want to fundamentally change the relation, the fundamental and most important relation, the relation between wealth and power and the working class, which generates that wealth and affords that power to the holders of that wealth. So we support reforms like toppling Colston into the Bristol Harbour. It wouldn't have been our first choice. I've lost my screen. I hope you can still see you. It wouldn't have been our first target if we had a large crowd who were ready to take direct action. But of course we support it. We despise Colston. We despise Rhodes. We despise the colonialists, the imperialists, and the racists. And we are ready to support efforts through councils and governmental pressure and so on to completely reevaluate the public realm in terms of its statuary, in terms of its iconography. We support that. But we have a duty to point out that that will neither fundamentally change things. If every statue of Edward Colston is replaced by a statue of Florence Nightingale, it will not change who owns your labor, who has the right to exploit your labor, who decides whether you will work or not, and for what you will work, and for how long you will work, or with whom your country goes to war, with whom your country is in alliance, with whom your country is against. None of these things will change if every statue is down, if every policeman becomes a model of gentlemanly conduct. That will not change the fact that the purpose of the police and the purpose of the state is to defend the wealth and power and privilege of the ruling class in this country. And you can put lipstick on it as we favor. We prefer lipstick, actually. I do anyway. But that will not change its fundamental character. As I pointed out, I think last week, I was on the picket lines of 1984-85. And all of us were white. And every police officer wore a tie. Not like today when a police officer's 19 stone and clad in body armor and wielding a fearsome array of weaponry. They were all wearing a tie. They were all white. We were all white. All they had was truncheons. But they laid into the miners with a savagery which was unsurpassed in this country for the best part of a century. Ditto in France. The yellow vests, it didn't have to be black. Most of them were not. They didn't have to be Muslims. Most of them were not. But they were brutally, ruthlessly suppressed week after week, with not a murmur of protest, by the way, from the British left as a whole. The British left didn't want to know the yellow vests. And that's one of the problems. Because for many in the British left, this was a very large body of predominantly white people challenging political power in France. And so woke has the British left become that automatically rang alarm bells with them. There's something wrong with this yellow vests. They're all white. And that, I think, is part of the problem to which I am alluding. So all the time, we will be arguing for unity. We will be arguing against tactics that serve to divide the working class we wish to unify. I close on one vexed issue. And here I know I'm going to lose the sympathy of some of the people watching. We cannot accept that if I self-define right now as Marcus Rashford, I will not be him. I'm lacking in many, many attributes. Now, you can humor me if you like and call me Marcus, but I cannot be Marcus Rashford. And a man cannot be a woman. A woman is a biological and scientific definition of a human person, of the female sex. And that cannot be changed. Sure, you can wish that you were, and many apparently do. And if you come across me, you will find me unusually empathetic to you. As I've said to you before, I had a comrade who was a man, who transitioned to a woman, and who then transitioned back again. I don't know what his situation is today, but the last time I saw him, he was back to being a man. And so I call him he. And I called him he when I first met him, and I shook his hand. I called him she when he transitioned, and I kissed her cheek. And when he transitioned back again, I called him he, and I shook his hand. That's just the way I am. I'm empathetic to the human condition. As Marx said, nothing human is alien to me. Trust me, I've seen it all, and more than once. But whilst you can define yourself as a woman, you cannot force other people to accept that self-definition of yours. Least of all can you expect, coerce public policy to accept your definition. You cannot demand to run in a girls' race or play in girls' netball. You cannot demand to get changed in a girls' changing room. You cannot demand to use a woman's toilet, because just as my right to swing my fist ends at the end of your nose, so your right to live your life telling people you're a woman ends when you seek to transgress on women's space and women's rights. And that is something that differentiates the Workers' Party from, it would seem, almost all of what calls itself the left. And I'm being generous in defining Labour as part of the left. Labour has gone completely berserk on this question, and the ultra-left Trotskyite organizations long ago went completely berserk on it. Labour, for example, has something we would not have: all women shortlists. But it allows men who define themselves as women to be members of an all-woman shortlist. Probably the most foolish political decision I have ever heard. Utterly ridiculous from every standpoint, even their own professed wish to use positive discrimination policies to get more women into Parliament and into council seats. So you set up an all-woman shortlist and you allow a biological, scientific man to be a part of that all-woman shortlist. That kind of madness is not for us, and we will call it out. We will resist any temptation to allow men to define themselves as women for the purposes of winning gold medals in girls' athletic sporting prowess, because it's not fair to the actual girls. It's not fair to the actual women. It is taking rights away from women and girls. And we cannot support that. And we now have a situation where the one-time guru of women's liberation, a friend of mine whom I've known for 40 years, Germaine Greer, is literally no platformed in Britain's universities because she will not accept that men have the right to declare themselves women and everyone else has to accept that they are women. Imagine. And there are others. Linda Bellos, a militant feminist and one-time ultra-leftist, lesbian activist, is similarly no platformed on university campuses and on left-wing platforms because she too insists that to permit, to accept this self-IDing is not just ridiculous, but it is an offense against the rights of actual women and actual girls. And when it reaches into the demand that male convicts should be allowed to serve their terms in female prisons with consequences which are only too well known. Well, I'm sorry, but no one in their right mind can support that. And no woman I know is prepared to allow men to come into the changing rooms, in the swimming pools, in the gymnasia, in which their daughters are changing, because that is an offense against them. So we're different. We think that the endless infatuation with these kind of identity political issues divides the working class, and the unity of the working class is our number one purpose. And so we will not be winning any prizes from the woke brigade. But frankly, we don't seek them. It is a possibly unique, certainly a differentiation between us as a workers' party and the rest of the left. One last point, forgive me. We consider that forcing children in schools to accept this self-definition madness, allowing children to be medicated with beta blockers and hormone treatment to divert their development is child abuse. It is, and ought to be, a criminal offense. It's certainly an offense against the Hippocratic Oath, and any doctor participating in it should be ashamed of themselves. It's far too young to be confused by bringing drag queens into schools, as hideously we saw in Paisley, led in by an SNP MP. It's far too young for that kind of exposure, and we will oppose it. I'm confident that in so doing, we would have the support of the vast majority of right-thinking people in the country. It may earn us the opprobrium of people who call themselves left-wing. But we don't regard it as being left-wing. We believe it to be an individualistic piece of adventurism, social adventurism, of which we disapprove and against which we stand. Unity is our watchword. Unity around class is what we stand for, and anything that gets in its way will not be supported by us, and if it's particularly egregious, will be opposed by us. Rob, that's where I stand. It's where the Workers' Party stands. The floor is now there for everyone to respond. Any question?
Thanks very much, George. Yeah, we've got some questions come in and some people wanting to make contributions. Bobby, I'm going to go to you first. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hello. My first question is, do you think identity politics is inevitable and will always exist in a society, or can it be curtailed and eventually eliminated through social or cultural change?
I don't think it's inevitable. I've lived long enough to have lived and been active in socialist politics before it emerged. I joined the Labour Party in 1967. And so for at least a decade, maybe more than a decade, these kind of issues of identity politics were at the very least secondary, and whatever comes after secondary, thirdly, fourthly, to the class issues of the day. So that, for example, I was a leading militant at a young age in Labour Party politics and union politics in Scotland in the 1970s, and no such thing emerged. Indeed, I can date my very first exposure to it when I was speaking at a rally outdoors by the banks of the River Clyde. The chairman was Dennis Canavan, a hirsute, unmistakably male figure, and he introduced me, and as was my wont then, I opened with the words, "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," and a cat's chorus from men from the university began to hurl. At first I couldn't hear it, but it became clear they were saying, "Chairperson, chairperson." And I remember it because it was the first time I had come across this kind of mindset. I argued my corner then, but I gave it up as not being worth fighting about. I said, Dennis is a man and he's in the chair. And so I called him chairman. If he'd been a woman and in the chair, I wouldn't have said chairman. But thereafter I said chair rather than chairman. But the date of that was 1980. So in other words, the whole of the class fighting 1970s took place without me being conscious of identity politics as creeping into the discourse and indeed the preoccupations of the left. So I think that as it has not always been with us, it would be wrong to say that it always will be with us. Of course, everything changes, but the fundamentals don't change. Not from 1920 or 1820, they haven't changed at all. The issue for us is who rules, and for whom are they ruling? And that will trump identity politics for us always.
Thank you very much, George. Right, we've got a question from Mara. Let's go to Mara.
Hi, George. A pleasure to see you again.
Hello, Mara.
I wanted to ask if you think identity politics is primarily a tool to rob the working class of freedom of speech. I had a conversation with McDonald a few years ago when the anti-Semitism crisis was in bloom. And I was suspended by the Labour Party for supposed anti-Semitism for ridiculous reasons. And I approached McDonald after a speech and asked him, but what's happening to the freedom of speech of members of the Labour Party? And his answer completely shocked me because he led me to believe that he assumed I was right-wing because I said I upheld freedom of speech, and that's supposedly it's a very right-wing concept. So do you think that apart from the obvious intention to divide and rule, do you think that perhaps it's also an attempt to rob people in the working class of freedom of speech and to rob people of their means to talk about real oppression and instead sanitize things on the speech level, as if, you know, if everybody speaks nicely and doesn't offend anybody, then surely we all live in a world without oppression. And the more you take people's freedom away, the less really oppressed people can talk about things. And this was a pattern that I've noticed in the Labour Party quite a bit. If I once put my fingers up to talk about why the Labour Party doesn't connect with people, normal people, and I use the word poor people because there are a lot of poor people where I live. And somebody for momentum, silenced me and never allowed me to speak in that meeting again because the word poor was extremely offensive. Therefore, my idea to connect with the poor people died because obviously it's much more important to sanitize our speech. And I think that maybe the death of freedom of speech, which again in the West it seemed like a trivial manner, because I think Westerners don't have an experience of having it taken away. But it's kind of the canary in the coal mine of what's becoming a very intensive tyranny. And again, as a Romanian, I've lived through covert tyranny, and I can tell that the way to control people is absolutely by taking their freedom of speech away. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think that's a very interesting angle. Nothing that you could tell me about Ramsay MacDonald would surprise me at all, and that didn't surprise me. It is indeed offensive to be poor, but it's not offensive to talk about people being poor. And the example that you give, the experience that you had, tells us everything about the way in which the so-called left in the Labour Party and outside of it has travelled down this rabbit hole. It's found most acutely on the issue of trans rights. There is no doubt, I'm here to tell you, I could show you my scars, there is no doubt that there is a reign of intellectual terror in the country about that subject. And that's the reason why a tiny number of people have been able to bring about really quite important and significant changes in local and even national government. Boris Johnson seems to be putting the brakes on it now, but until this week, it seemed like an unstoppable juggernaut, that children's sexual development can be the subject of intervention by educationalists and by health professionals on the basis of the child's wish for that development to go in one way rather than another. A child long way short of being of an age to make such an important decision. Children that are way young and far too young to be allowed to smoke, too young to be allowed to actually have sex, are nonetheless well old enough, it seems, to decide that they want to change their sex. And their school and their doctor will participate in that change, even though the person asking for it is a young child. Now, it's very difficult to speak out against these things. And when you do, you are assailed as a rightist. Even someone as woke as J.K. Rowling has been virtually torn to pieces in social media in the last week for stating the bleeding obvious that women menstruate, men cannot menstruate. The fact that some women don't menstruate, a tiny number of them, is not a reason for doubting the scientific reality of that statement. Men can not menstruate. And therefore, Rowling has become virtually a non-person. And yet, only a week or two before, she would have topped the pops for on every kind of level of wokeness, liberalism, the EU, hostility to Corbyn. She'd have been a princess of wokeism. But as soon as she spoke out on this question of self-IDing, she was struck down, torn down and not a pretty sight, was it either? So yes, people who seek to smuggle their minority concerns through the legislative process, through the public policy process, have an incentive to ensure that those speaking out against them, seeking to stop them, are vilified, marginalized, and if possible, criminalized. And that's something that we will not put up with, not least because the working class, who don't all have the vocabulary of wokeness, are the first people who will be policed by the woke police for their un-PC views on these or even other matters. And we will never stand by while the working class is silenced.
Thank you, George. I've got a contribution from Christina now to go to.
Hello, comrades. Hello, George. I hope you can hear me fine. My connection is not brilliant tonight, but the discussion is.
Very good.
So we know as socialists, capitalism brings barbarity, and individualism breeds cannibalism. Apparently, what you described there with Rowling, it's sheer cannibalism. And this is because we live in a society where the way one feels, and you can feel something today which will change tomorrow, but can influence the legal recognition of gender identity, which is, it has so many consequences, and it is national and also supranational, and it affects children's rights. And the thing that worries me is that when we allow 5-year-old children to choose their gender expression at the age of 5, how does that protect them from legislation tomorrow that will bring the age of consent to that age where they can actually choose their sexual identity, right? So it really gives me goosebumps to think about that, because capitalism basically wants to exploit the last taboo, which is the children, the most vulnerable. This is the last taboo that we have as a society, and it's already happening. And we call prostitution sex work, because this is how capitalism dictates us to call it. And we call slavery child work. So this is how we start changing our vocabulary so that these things become permissible. Now, a lot of people see through this, they see it as a rampant imposition from the ruling classes. And I, for one, I've been in academia for many years, and I saw how these more postmodern doctrines of identities started influencing the way we teach humanity. So there's a whole generation that now has been educated in seeing the world through this doctrine. And there is, as you very well described, there is a huge mass of people, ordinary people, who perceive this as a degeneration of an unfair and immoral system. They understand that this is directed against them, and they understand that this is against family itself. However, as a socialist, I see this as a very worrying thing, because the reaction of the masses right now, as we saw it, is extremely favorable ground for the rise of fascism. Because fascism comes exactly at this point, it pretends to be with a part of the people, and it pretends it wants to purify society from this phenomenon of degeneration. And historical research has demonstrated this, how important this logical and psychological factor was for the rise of the Nazis in Germany, on the basis that the Weimar Republic was degenerate. So we have to be very careful here. We are the left that actually wants to treat these phenomena scientifically and objectively and historically, and not based on how people feel. And we mustn't forget that this is capitalism that wants to turn everything into a market. This is the principle, it's profit. Let's look at the economics. If you go, I checked, my daughter is 12 years old. I was checking the other day what she's been exposed to through Instagram, for example. Instagram manipulates for this generation of young kids a variety of sexual orientations as products to be sold. But it's the kids themselves with their own bodies exploring sexual expressions at the age of 12, putting up mascara if you're a boy, and being celebrated as an icon of liberation at the age of 12 on Instagram. This is a new market to be exploited. It suits capitalism. This is why they do it. We have to understand this. And the exploitation, as I said, is going to lose all kinds of taboos. But we cannot play with the biological core of the family, because the family it has a biological reality. And this biological reality, to have a baby, you need an heterosexual couple. How can we play with this? Again, capitalism plays with it. It creates surrogacy. It creates a market of surrogate mothers, which is an abhorrent exploitation of the body of the woman and of maternity. And it does that again for profit. So we don't need to look for more sinister motives. The more sinister and barbaric motive is the motive of profit. People who relegate other people to the position of being breeding machines for those who can afford to pay for it. So the problem is not moral. The problem is scientific, historical, and objective. It cannot be based on a choice that we have. It's not a symbolic construction. It has reality. And if we don't protect children, we don't protect family, we don't protect women, we will lose everything as a society. We lose our biological, I call it biological core. So therefore we become just a mass, a malleable mass of consumers. And nowadays you're not, even as a baby, you can be a consumer. They teach as a baby. Look at the access that babies have to the technology. They become consumers from day one. And capitalism promotes that. And as you very well said, there are people in the left who think it is radical. It is a criterion of social movement purity to see individual rights as the holy grail. Well, we're not here to pretend that individual rights are going to solve problems. Capitalism will do everything to prevent people from having organizing and revolution through deceiving us, through spreading illusions, and what we saw last week, the policies of divide and reign between races, between everything, with everything, focusing on peculiarities, linguistic, cultural, everything that can divide us. We must do the exact opposite, as you said, George, unite in defense of the core of humanity, defend what they told us in university day one. They told us big narratives do not work. There is no big narrative, right? Big narrative meaning everything that can make people understand that we have collective identities such as class. And it is the opposite that we have to do as a party. We have to unite on the basis of solidarity with those that the system oppresses in real terms, in objective terms. Who is hungry? Who is homeless? Who is the woman who cannot afford child minding and has to, to stay at home and feed the kids right now in this crisis? Objectivity, reality, material conditions. This is what will unite us. Sorry, I have a lot to say on this subject. I'm sorry if I went on for so long. Thank you.
Don't be sorry. You did have a lot to say, and all of it was extremely powerful. And I won't seek to repeat it. except in this regard. Marx predicted that under capitalism, all that was solid would melt into air, and all that was sacred would be profaned. And that is exactly where we are now. That which was once solid in our lives has melted into air, and all that is sacred, like the family, like love, like children, like community life, is being profaned, and it's being profaned in the name of profit, in the name of individualism, and that masquerades as socialism. It is absurd. I know that capitalism reduces everything to the cash nexus, but for us, for people on the left, to be brandishing terminology like sex is work, sex workers, these are absurdities. They are reducing even the most intimate relations between human beings to being a cash transaction. And we will never accept that. Big narratives are not over. In fact, it's only the big narrative that can liberate all of our people, irrespective of their peculiarities, irrespective of their singularities, all of which we accept and respect. We will support discrimination against none. We will support bigotry against none, hatred of none. Don't misunderstand or misrepresent us. We will, if necessary, stand and give our blood in defense of a human being being attacked for their color or their sexual orientation. But our big narrative is that the unity of the working class is the only way to fundamentally change our society, to take power from the powerful, to redistribute the wealth of the wealthy. That's our goal.
Thank you very much, George and Christina. I'm going to go to Sophia. Now you've got a contribution to make.
Hi, George.
Hi, Sophia.
Hi there. Look, the establishment have a very powerful tool they use to divide us, and that is identity politics. And wow, has it been effective over the last few years. So I joined the Labour Party in 2016 because of Jeremy Corbyn. I wasn't really interested in politics before then. And there was a real buzz, you know, great policies. We respected the result of the referendum. You know, there was a real movement similar to the Bernie Sanders movement in the States. Now you fast forward to 2019. If you were mad enough to be out campaigning for Labour last year, it was awful. We'd moved from, you know, and we were on the offence in 2016 and 17. We were constantly defending ourselves last year, our Brexit position, our policies, the smears on anti-Semitism. So what took place in that time? Well, I'm going to share my experience. Now, I was a Remainer, and at the time I was overseas and I'd seen the mainstream media coverage of the referendum and Brexit. I came home to find out my family and most of my friends had voted to leave. And I was furious. You couldn't reason with me. I was blindsided with my hate for Nigel Farage. I thought the campaign was racist. And it was fed on a very anti-immigrant rhetoric. And I was angry, but I did listen to my family and friends, and I did go away and I studied. And for context, my mum is black, my dad is white, I'm mixed race, my family and friends are very mixed, and they predominantly voted to leave. And I couldn't understand it at the time. Now, the penny dropped when my mum said to me, she said, "So why do you think the campaign was racist?" And, you know, the realization hit me because I had learned that nearly every real socialist and communist and several trade unions and Tony Benn and my hero, Jeremy Corbyn, that got me into politics in the first place, all wanted to leave the EU. So why were there no voices of the left? Why were you not invited on the mainstream media platforms like, you know, Nigel Farage was? And Lexit was very much dismissed as a loony lefties fringe. So then it started getting nasty. And, you know, people were saying that those that voted for Leave were thick. I was thinking, hang on, my family are better educated than me. And they were saying that Leave voters were racist. Well, okay, now you're just brushing over the fact that many Black and brown people voted for Leave. And they said, you know, they voted because they believed something on the side of a bus, you know, and they'll vote better next time because they didn't know what they were doing. And I just found that unbelievable, because even though I was blindsided by what I'd seen in the mainstream media, my friends would tell me all about neoliberalism, collective bargaining, attacking workers' rights. And you want to talk about racism, occupation of the Western Sahara, the EU support. You know, what about the crisis of the refugees? So I'm ashamed that I was on the same side of those people that were, you know, punching down. It was pure Benefit Street energy, if you remember that awful program. So, and still worse, you know, you had those people uploading pictures of them on like the Eurostar, which nobody can afford to go on, with an espresso and a croissant, crying about not being in Europe anymore, as if the UK was going to like sprout legs and move to the other side of the Atlantic and join another continent. So I changed my position on Brexit, but I wasn't very vocal about it because I didn't want to be judged how I judged others. I'll be quite frank. And I know people that voted for Brexit, white people that voted for Brexit, that didn't admit to it for fear of being called a racist. And this is the danger. This is where, because look at the voter turnout. There was a universal conscious awakening for change. It happened with the election of Trump. Were there racists that voted for Trump? Yes. Were there people that were ill-informed that voted? Of course. But people voted because they really needed and wanted change. So what they did was essentially shut down conversation. And this is exactly how they divide us. And it's not the blatantly obvious, Farage is Farage and the Daily Mail is the Daily Mail. We know what they are. It was what influenced me was the very woke liberal media, you know, The Guardian, the so-called left media that I followed, and who pushed the who pushed the Remain side. And they also threw our allies, Chris Williamson, Mark Wadsworth, under the bus. So I think even Novara said Jackie Walker isn't even Jewish. They were saying awful things. And if you were out campaigning for the Labour Party last year, I think many people will agree the nail in the coffin was the anti-Semitism smear, because once again, they shut down conversation. I remember being in town holding a Labour banner and someone coming over to me and pushing me over and calling me an anti-Semite. And that really broke my heart. And they knew where to get the left, because all of us, like you say, would get out in the streets and we would fight for the rights of Jewish people. If you're Muslim, whatever, we'd fight for your rights, and it really affects us. But what they did was shut down real conversation, because I didn't feel like I could speak about it. I'm not Jewish, but I wanted to stick up for my friends, but I also want to support Palestinians. It's really difficult. And I realized I'd been misled, George, because, you know, you're not afraid to speak the truth and for what you believe in. But there's that great Malcolm X quote, I'm for the truth no matter who tells it. And I just think we need to be a bit better, because there's going to be people that you don't like that are going to speak the truth, and people that you really like and idolize, I did Jeremy Corbyn, that are going to really let you down. So I've been on a journey, and I'm trying my best not to be reactionary. And it's very revealing when I see people on Twitter and on social media, laying into you. And the thing is, you always keep the debate and conversation on class. So it tells me that they're dividers, they're liberal, they're not really socialists. So of course, the message was so important to me. But I'll be honest, it really mattered what it looked like. I was concerned about the optics, and that wokeness, that left media that really pushed me in that direction. So I'm getting better. We're all on a journey. Yeah, I just thought I'd share that with you. Nothing else to say. I'm rambling now.
It's a fascinating journey, and I'm glad that you have arrived at this destination in the Workers' Party. Of course, the Brexit referendum, the Brexit issue, led to a multiplication of identity politics battles, and gave rise to some of the things I have said that are widely repeated, that calling everyone to the right of you a racist, calling everyone who is a racist a fascist, is of course not likely to win friends and influence people. Shouting abusive names against people, often, in fact, usually, unjustifiably, that practice has led to the collapse of the Red Wall and the coming to power of Keir Starmer, the re-establishment of Blairism forever, I think, because I don't believe that they will ever make the mistake of allowing a Corbyn-type figure to come to power in Labour ever again. So the stakes were extremely high. The Labour Party's U-turn on Brexit from, as you say, in 2017, accepting the result of the referendum, to in 2019 being absolutely overtly the party that would force you to vote again in an attempt to wreck Brexit. The consequences have been grave, and they're not just grave for you and me, they're grave for poor children that have to live for another 4.5 years under a Conservative government. They are grave for the poorest parts and the poorest people in our society. So those who forced that U-turn will bear a very heavy historical burden. Let me make the point that I made earlier today on social media. Apart from Nigel Farage opposing the Iraq war, the war that Labour waged and which killed 1 million people, and the Brexit issue, I have nothing in common with Nigel Farage. I have met him 3 times in my life, twice in TV studios and once on a platform, a public meeting. That's it. I have not set eyes on him since 2016. And yet I'm, as you alluded, often accused of being his friend, cozy, his buddy, and so on. Well, 3 times, 2 of them on TV and 1 on a platform, does not cozy or friends make. But I believe that in a binary referendum, my choice of being on a platform with Nigel Farage was better than the platform of the Remainers being on a platform with Tony Blair. Tony Blair killed 1 million people. Nigel Farage didn't kill anybody. And so this name-calling culture is part of the identity politics issue that we are talking about tonight. The EU immigrants who were in Britain were overwhelmingly white people. The jobs and job insecurity and increasing rents and increasing inability to access public services in Britain were suffered more by people of color than by other people. The unskilled, low-paid white immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe were competing first with black and brown people in Britain. That's why 30% of black and brown people in Britain voted for Brexit, even though the myth was fostered that black and brown people in Britain regarded Brexit as racist. And as I always say, if you think England's racist, you've never lived in France. If you think that Britain is racist, then you don't know the EU at all. And neither do you know the extent to which black and brown people are right now being drowned in the Mediterranean with the fortress European Union not giving a toss about it. And the EU's foreign policy towards Libya, for example, turning it into a slaver's hellhole. The French government, the British government, the Italian government, all of them bombing, attacking, destroying Libya. What's racist? Supporting a Brexit or supporting that kind of a European Union? But that's last year's battle. Even people who did not and have not changed their mind about Brexit are welcome in the Workers' Party, as long as they accept that Brexit is done, that Britain is leaving, and it's not going back into the European Union. If you accept that, you can continue to regret that, if you like, but you must accept it. That is where we are. So thanks very much for that contribution.
Thanks very much, George. That's very squarely put there. I'm going to go to Fran next. He's got his hand up.
You're right. Evening, everyone. I just wanted to mention something on this subject because it's something that everybody always is sort of scared to talk about. But it's not just about one thing. Nobody who is anti-identity politics is against anyone else's right to exist. We're just against the pitching of two groups of people against each other, and we're for uniting those groups of people who would be pitched against each other, and directing them at the right people, which is the capitalist class. This sort of thing reminds me of the old pyramid of capitalism painting from 1910 or whatever. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but it's like a pyramid. Yeah. You've got the bourgeois, then the church, then it's the royalty at the top, then the church, then the army, then the bourgeois, then the workers at the bottom that are all getting trampled on because they're scrabbling around fighting. So if anyone wants to look up that out, it's called the pyramid of capitalism. But I just wanted to highlight that it's not about just trans people or gay people, or this is about white nationalism. It's about black nationalism. It's about feminism. It's about subcultures fighting against each other. Mods and rockers are different identities that fight each other. This goes down deep. Some groups are more life-threatening than others, like subcultures, for example. But these are the things that we need to identify and unite. If mods and rockers united to fight the government, then what a beautiful sight that would have been back in the 60s. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that to our members, that this isn't just about trans people. And a fine example that I mentioned in the chat earlier of identity politics uniting to fight a greater good is lesbians and gays support the miners. So if anyone wants to look that up, that is two groups of oppressed people coming together to support a common goal and fight for each other. So I suggest people look into them as well. And there's a good movie about them as well.
A very good movie. Look, I'm old enough to remember the time in Scotland where a mixed marriage was the way you described a man and a woman, both white Scottish Christians, but from different churches. That was a mixed marriage in Scotland. That was widely described. So-and-so was in a mixed marriage because a Catholic had married a Protestant. So I'm not disputing in any way that we all have identities, some of which we did not choose, some of which we did choose. And no one's asking anyone to sublimate or hide or never mention their other identities. We merely ask them to come together with others from different traditions, different identities, under the banner of the big identity, the big narrative, the workers, class, and socialism.
Thank you, George. I'm going to go to Claire, if you would like to come on. Okay, Claire did have a question, but maybe isn't able to respond right now. I'm going to go to the next person.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you now.
Brilliant.
Hello, Claire. Hello.
Hi, George, and hi, everyone. Wow. Christina basically said everything I wanted to say, only at such a high level. Really, really enjoyed listening to everybody. I remember thinking and tweeting, if it was only the Palestine issue, I'd still join the Workers' Party. But now I've got something else, and it's this rejection of identity politics, which I think is crucial, particularly at the moment on this idea of safeguarding children, of standing up for women's rights and standing up for the rights of gay people. And may I add, many trans people who are battling with trans activism, which I see as being top down, divisive, a tool of neoliberalism to not only divide us, but also to deny our humanity. And it's all been said, and it's just so lovely to hear it. Yeah, so I'm just sitting here feeling incredibly relieved, because before the meeting I thought, oh, what if what if I'm not going to be able to, I couldn't cope with Labour right now. On this issue, the wokeness stuff just makes me nauseous. And I thought, oh my God, even if Labour were in and Corbyn was Prime Minister, I couldn't support that. I couldn't support the erosion of women's rights for another group. That doesn't make any sense. People losing jobs, people being deplatformed. Amazing. But I don't have to, because I'm not in that party anymore. And I'm in a party which so far reflects what I believe, which is incredibly pleasing. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a beautiful contribution. Jeremy and that section of the Labour Party have a lot to answer for in the development of identity politics. They were in the vanguard of that identity politics. I like to think that even for them it's gone too far, but I'm not sure. Certainly they did not stand up against the deplatforming of Linda Bellos, of Germaine Greer. They did not oppose men being on all women shortlists as long as they defined themselves as women, and so on. These are all things that emerged in the Corbyn era. And it's always been a difference between me and them. I was never a liberal, but for far too many people on the left, they confuse socialism with liberalism, and it isn't the same thing. Liberalism is a concept of individualism, and we believe in collectivism. As I put it, borrowing on from Neil Kinnock, we believe in us and always, not me and now. And I think that dichotomy, whilst unpopular with the rest of the left, is popular with the mass of the people. I'm perfectly sure if I took this microphone now out onto the streets and asked 100 people where they stand on these issues, the vast majority of them would be standing with us. And it's a small minority of woke liberals who have brought us to this place. The silent majority has been terrified into submission, terrified of being thought to be a reactionary, terrified of, as the last speaker said, actually even losing your job, because you can lose your job. In the media, you are guaranteed to lose your job. If you're a TV or radio presenter on one of the mainstream broadcasters, outlets, and you challenge, as we are doing now, these new orthodoxies, you will lose your job. And that will be true in many other workplaces too. And this censorship of people, which inevitably means the censorship of working class people who might fall foul of the language rules, might fall foul of the pronoun rules, then we can't accept it. We oppose it. It is not the same thing. Liberalism and socialism are not the same thing. They never were, and it's the fault of the so-called left that the two became conflated. And that, of course, takes many other forms. It's not just on this form. I have thought since the 1980s that the labor movement began to sound like they cared more about criminals than they did about the victims of crime. That they cared more, and Harriet Harman and others were really all involved in it, in redefining sexuality and ages of consent and so on. I saw this descent, I think it's a descent, into liberalism coming a long, long time ago. And I'm not only happy now that we're all in a party that is not afraid to call that what it is and to stand up to it.
Thank you, George. It certainly is a point that we should, all be quite clear about. It's going to be a duty for us as members of the Workers' Party to really help to separate these ideas and to demonstrate to people that, no, liberalism is not socialism. We do see that the language around that is used quite frequently in mainstream media. You see certainly in like the US media, the liberal side of politics is always referred to as the left by both sides, really.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Bob here. He's got his hand up. Can you hear us, Bob?
Hello?
Yes, Bob.
Hello, Bob. Can you hear us? No, I'll go to the next person.
There's Bob there. Yeah, he's there, but can't hear him.
I can't hear anything coming through. Okay, let's come back to Bob.
Can George hear me?
There you go. Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, listen, I was going to say, look, I reckon, if you're gay, lesbian, trans, whatever, that's up to you. it's a personal sexual decision what you want to do with your life. Now, I agree with them doing whatever they want to do, but why do they feel the need to impose it onto other people? Because I don't go around saying, "Hi, my name's Bob, I'm straight." You know, if I said, you know, well, I did actually, I called a lesbian, and I got charged for a hate crime, and it cost me 300 quid, even though she was a lesbian. I don't understand it. Why? I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think a lot of our people have become confused, bemused, frightened, for the reasons that I spoke of earlier. We, though, have to be clear. Socialism for us means the family. It means the community. It means the society. It means the country. It means the rights and the progress of the working people in that community, in that country. And that is a direction of travel. And we will not deviate from it.
What I was trying to ask was, why do they feel the need to instill it onto others? Because when I was younger, I was alone, and I was taken in by a guy who, you know, was trying to be my friend. The next thing I know, he's trying to turn me into a gay, and I didn't want that. He tried to make me something I wasn't. Yeah, and that's not right, is it? Surely.
Well, of course, I don't want to go into your own individual case, but everyone has. I mean, there's quite a wide spectrum of sexual desire and taste, and everyone will be different in that regard. And everyone is entitled, if they are consenting and if they are adult, to have sex with whomsoever they please and in what way that they please. But they cannot expect the public policy to be changed to suit their particular proclivity. That's all I'm saying in relation to the trans lobby. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, George. Let's go to Jack. You've got your hand up there.
Hi. So as socialists, obviously our job is to stamp into the dustbin of history class society. It is to tear down the institutions which the ruling class use to suppress us, to pummel us into the ground and rinse us for all the money that we have to afford them their luxury lifestyle. It's very obvious that we instead need to, whilst tearing down these institutions, rebuild them as bastions of working class power, to build a state for the working class, led and ran by the working class. And obviously the ruling class don't want this, do they? They propagated identity politics to divide us. They purposely propagated it amongst our movement to get us at each other's throats over identity, to purposely divide us, to stop us from organizing as a class, to overthrow them, to establish that state for ourselves, to lead as a class for ourselves and not be slaves to some CEO at the top. I'm sure, George, you'd agree when I say, or maybe you wouldn't, but I think you'd agree when I say that they purposely propagated this ideology onto us.
First of all, another star is born in the firmament of the Workers' Party. Wonderfully articulate, powerful. Jack, thank you for making that contribution. Yes, I do agree with you, but I'd also add the caveat that there were plenty of people in the so-called left that were more than ready to do it. No one had to pay them to do it. No one had to, as it were, direct them to do it. But it certainly has suited mightily the interests of the ruling class that the left and Labour, the trade unions even, have gone down this identity politics route. I go back to a point I made earlier. The 1970s was the most class conscious, the most militant, the period at which the Labour movement was at its strongest, when Harold Wilson had to fight 2 general elections on a manifesto committing the Labour Party to widespread nationalisation, where general strikes freed the Pentonville Five, where the bristling militancy of class consciousness was everywhere in the 1970s. And here I plug my audio book. I'll send it to you, Jack, for free. It's an audio book on the 1970s. I was there. I was fighting on the streets in the 1970s. And that period has as much in common with 2020 as, Echelfechen to Moscow. It is a world of difference. The labor movement in the 1970s is different in every dimension to 2020, and I don't say that in a good way. It's not a favorable comparison. Of course, there may be some things that are better now in 2020 than they were in the 1970s, but class consciousness is not one of them. A class consciousness in the 1970s, and we might call it a long decade, lasting up to the miners' strike and its defeat. Class consciousness was everything in Britain. Everybody knew that they were working class, if they were working class. Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and I think John Cleese did a sketch about it, which lives to this day. I look down on him because he's middle class, and I look down on him because he's working class, and so on. It suited them mightily. That's all I'll say. That we should turn against and in on each other. Fixating on, it's one of my jokes, forgive me if you've heard it. I trace the decline of the British Labour movement to the decision at trade union weekend schools. What are they, I hear you asking, to have everyone sit in a circle. And I'm only half joking because I saw it happening. In the beginning, you would go to a weekend school, you'd hear somebody magnificent like Jack Jones or Mr. Ben or Sam Aronovich, the father of David Aronovich, hard to believe, and you would learn. And then people said, no, we can't have this kind of hierarchism. Mr. Ben should sit in a circle with the rest of us, and he should have the same speaking rights as Johnny from Methil. That kind of mentality. I used to call it the Californiaization of the labor movement. And indeed, many of these ideas and practices came from the United States, came from the 1968 generation, came from the what is now Silicon Valley and so on. And so it's been a mighty bonus for the ruling class that we have spent the last 35 years arguing about personal pronouns. It's quite a result, Jack.
Thank you very much, George. We're almost at 9:30, So I think we're going to have to end for the evening here. Apologies to the other panelists who did have some contributions to make. There just isn't time. I hope that you will sign on next week for next week's meeting and maybe make a contribution then. To everyone who's been watching online on YouTube and the other platforms, if you're members, please do actually get involved and log in and participate in the meeting when you're able to. And to anyone that's just watching on the sides and has not yet got involved, please do. We'll be very pleased to have you on board. So that was a great meeting for the evening. Really good contributions there. And I'll leave the last words to you, George. We can leave off.
No, just to echo what you said, I think a lot of our members are watching on social media, but not on Zoom. We need to teach our people how to download Zoom, and that there are no dangers at all in doing so. The Chinese will not be listening to you throughout the week if you've got Zoom. So don't be shy, because you can't participate in the meeting unless you've got the Zoom. So thank you very much indeed, all of you.